The air outside the Dakota was cold, December cold, the kind that bites through your jacket and settles into your bones. It was just after 5 in the evening, December 8th, 1980, and the light was already fading from the sky. New York City moved around the building, like it always did. Taxis honking, people rushing. The city indifferent to everything except its own momentum. John Lennon stood on the sidewalk waiting for his car. He wore a black leather jacket and jeans. His hair was shorter than people remembered, cleaner. He looked like a man who'd finally figured something out, who'd finally found a version of himself he could live with. Yoko was beside him. They'd been in the recording studio all day, working on new music, the kind of work that felt like hope instead of obligation. John was smiling. Not the smile from the photographs everyone knew. Something quieter. Something that suggested he'd made peace with the noise in his head. A small group of people waited near the entrance. Fans. There were always fans. They held albums and photographs, pens ready, hoping for a moment. A signature, a word, something to prove they'd been close to him. John didn't ignore them. He never did. Not anymore. He walked over, started signing, talking, asking names, being present in a way he hadn't been for years. One man stood toward the back, quiet, holding a copy of Double Fantasy, the album John had just released. The man was heavy-set, wearing glasses, his face pale and expressionless. He didn't push forward like the others. He just waited. John signed 3 albums, 4, 5. Then he looked up and saw the man with the glasses. Their eyes met for a second. John smiled, walked over. "You want this signed?" John asked, reaching for the album. The man nodded, didn't say anything, just handed it over. John took the record, uncapped his pen, wrote his name across the front. Then he handed it back. "There you go." The man took the album, held it against his chest, still didn't speak. John studied him for a second. There was something in the silence, something that felt off, not threatening, just absent, like the man was there but not there. "You all right?" John asked. The man blinked. "Yeah." "You sure?" "Yeah." John nodded slowly. He'd been around enough people to know when something was wrong, but he'd also learned not to push. People carried their own weight. You couldn't take it from them just because you noticed it. "Take care of yourself," John said. The man didn't respond. John turned back toward the car. Yoko was already inside. He climbed in beside her. The driver pulled away from the curb. And the man with the glasses stood on the sidewalk, holding the signed album, watching the car disappear into traffic. 62 minutes. That's how much time was left. The recording studio was in Midtown, a place John had been coming to for weeks now, working on songs, rebuilding something he thought he'd lost. For 5 years, he'd stepped away from music, from the noise, from the pressure. He'd stayed home, raised his son, baked bread, learned how to be still. People thought he'd disappeared, that he'd given up. But John hadn't given up. He'd just realized that the version of himself the world wanted wasn't the version he could live with anymore. The Beatles had ended a decade ago, but the weight of them hadn't. Everywhere he went, people wanted that John. The sharp one, the clever one, the one who said things that cut through the noise and made headlines. But the John had been exhausting. That John had been angry all the time. That John had been running from something he couldn't name. So he stopped running, stopped performing, stopped pretending he had answers. And in the quiet, he found something he hadn't expected. A version of himself that didn't need to prove anything. That could sit with his son and not think about the next album. That could write a song just because it felt good, not because it needed to mean something. Double Fantasy was the result of that. An album about love, about partnership, about choosing to stay when everything in you wants to run. It wasn't revolutionary. It wasn't trying to change the world. It was just honest. And people didn't know what to do with it. The reviews had been mixed. Some critics called it soft, safe, a far cry from the John Lennon who'd written Imagine and Working Class Hero. They wanted edge. They wanted anger. They wanted the man who'd challenged them. But John didn't care. Not the way he used to. He'd spent too many years caring what people thought. Too many years trying to be the thing they needed him to be. And it had nearly killed him. Inside the studio, John sat at the piano. The engineer adjusted levels. Yoko listened from the couch, her eyes closed, taking in the sound. John played a few chords. Stopped. Played them again. He was working on something new, a melody that had been sitting in his head for days. He couldn't find the words yet, just the feeling. "It's close," he said, mostly to himself. "Play it again," Yoko said without opening her eyes. John played it again, this time slower, letting each note settle before moving to the next. And there it was. The thing he'd been looking for, not in the melody, in the space between the notes. He smiled. Looked over at Yoko. "I think we've got something." She opened her eyes. "I know. They worked for another hour. No pressure. No deadline. Just two people making something because they wanted to. Because it felt right." When they finally stopped, John leaned back and stretched. His body hurt. He was 40 years old, felt older some days. But tonight, he felt light. "You ready to head back?" Yoko asked. John nodded. "Yeah. Let's go home." They left the studio just after 10. The city was louder now. The night crowd spilling out of bars and restaurants, the streets slick with rain that had fallen while they were inside. The driver brought the car around. John and Yoko climbed in. The same car from earlier. The same route home. John stared out the window as they drove, watching the city pass. The lights, the people, all of it moving like a river that never stopped. He thought about his son, about putting him to bed, about the quiet of the apartment after the noise of the day. "You think people will understand this one?" he asked. Yoko didn't need to ask what he meant. "Does it matter?" John thought about it. "No, I guess it doesn't." "Then stop asking." He smiled. She was right. She was always right. That was the thing about Yoko that drove people crazy. She didn't need him to be John Lennon. She just needed him to be John. And that was harder. That required him to be present. To be honest. To stop hiding behind the persona. The car pulled up to the Dakota. The same entrance. The same archway. The lights from inside spilling out onto the street. John opened the door, stepped out into the cold. Yoko followed. The driver stayed with the car. They walked toward the entrance. John had his hands in his pockets, his head down, not because he was hiding, just because he was tired. It had been a long day, a good day, but long. He didn't see the man until it was too late. The man with the glasses, the one from earlier. He was standing in the shadows near the archway, still holding the album, still silent. But now there was something else, something in his hand. John looked up, saw him. Recognition flashed across his face. Not fear, just confusion. Like he was trying to understand why the man was still there. The man raised his hand, and everything stopped. The first shot hit John in the back. He stumbled forward. Didn't fall. Didn't scream. Just stumbled, like he'd tripped over something he couldn't see. The second shot hit him again. Then a third. Then a fourth. John fell to his knees. His hands went to the ground. He tried to stand, couldn't. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. He looked back over his shoulder, saw the man standing there, the gun still in his hand, smoke curling from the barrel. Yoko screamed, ran to him, dropped to the ground beside him, her hands on his chest, his blood on her hands. "John," she said, her voice breaking. "John, stay with me." He tried to speak. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. His eyes found hers. And in that look was everything he couldn't say, everything he'd never get to say. The doorman ran out, saw what had happened, ran back inside to call for help. People started gathering. Strangers, neighbors, all of them frozen, watching, not knowing what to do. The man with the glasses didn't run. He just stood there, dropped the gun, pulled out a book. The Catcher in the Rye. Started reading it, like nothing had happened, like he'd just been waiting for this moment, and now that it was here, he had nothing left to do. The police arrived in minutes, the ambulance right behind them. They loaded John onto a stretcher. Yoko climbed in beside him. The ambulance pulled away, sirens cutting through the night. John Lennon was pronounced dead at 11:07 p.m., 62 minutes after he'd stood outside the Dakota and signed an album for a man whose name he didn't know. 62 minutes after he'd asked if the man was all right. 62 minutes after he'd told him to take care of himself. The world found out within hours. The news spread like a shockwave. Radio stations interrupted their programming. Television anchors broke down on air. People gathered outside the Dakota, hundreds of them. Then thousands. Standing in silence, holding candles, crying for a man most of them had never met, but felt like they knew. Because John Lennon wasn't just a musician. He was a voice, a mirror, a person who'd said the things they felt but couldn't articulate, who'd been angry when they were angry, who'd been vulnerable when they were scared, who'd tried to change the world and then admitted he didn't know how. And now he was gone. The man with the glasses was arrested. Didn't resist. Didn't try to explain. Just went quietly. Later, in interrogations, he said he did it because he wanted to be somebody. Because John Lennon was famous, and if he killed John Lennon, he'd be famous too. He said it like it made sense. Like it was reasonable. Like taking a life was just another way to be seen. But the truth was more complicated than that. The man wasn't a monster. He was broken. He'd spent his whole life feeling invisible, feeling like the world moved around him without noticing he was there. And somewhere along the way, he decided that the only way to be seen was to destroy something people loved. He didn't hate John Lennon. He didn't even really know him. John was just a symbol, a target, a way to matter. And that's the part that made it unbearable, that John died not because of who he was, but because of what he represented to someone who couldn't find another way to feel real. In the hours after John's death, people searched for meaning, for a reason, for something that would make sense of the senselessness. Some blamed the fame, said John should have had more security, should have been more careful, should have known better than to stand on a public sidewalk and sign autographs. Others blamed the man, said he was evil, crazy, that he should never have been walking the streets, that someone should have seen it coming. But the truth was simpler and harder than either of those things. John Lennon died because he was kind, because when he saw a man standing in the cold, holding an album, he didn't walk past him. He stopped. He signed the record. He asked if the man was okay. He treated him like a human being. And 62 minutes later, that man killed him. There's no lesson in that. No moral. No way to make it mean something. It's just what happened. The last conversation John Lennon had wasn't with Yoko. It wasn't with his son. It wasn't with a friend or a fellow musician. It was with a stranger. A man whose pain had twisted into something unrecognizable. A man who needed help but didn't know how to ask for it. And John, in his last free moments on Earth, tried to reach him, tried to see him, tried to offer something, even if it was just a signed album and a moment of attention. It wasn't enough. It couldn't be enough. But it was everything John had to give. That's the weight of it. The unbearable weight. That kindness didn't save him. That care didn't protect him. That being present and human and trying to connect didn't matter in the face of someone else's unraveling. People still gather outside the Dakota. 40 years later. Longer. They leave flowers. Light candles. Stand in the spot where John fell, trying to be close to something they lost. But John isn't there. He's in the music, in the songs that still play, in the words that still resonate, in the idea that maybe, just maybe, we can imagine a better world even if we never get to see it. He's in the last 62 minutes. In the choice to stop and sign an album, to ask if someone's okay, to treat a stranger with dignity. That's what history remembers. Not the bullets, not the man who fired them, but the fact that John Lennon, minutes before he died, chose kindness. And maybe that's not enough. Maybe it doesn't change anything. Maybe the world keeps spinning and people keep hurting and none of it makes sense. But it's something. It's the thing John gave. The thing he kept giving until he couldn't anymore. 62 minutes. That's all it was. A conversation without words. A moment of recognition between two people who never should have crossed paths. One of them went home. Held his son. Closed his eyes and dreamed of the songs he'd write tomorrow. The other stood in the shadows and waited. And when the moment came, he took everything. And the world, which had been loud and bright and full of possibility, went quiet. Not forever, but long enough to realize what it had lost.